Hello, good morning, and welcome to Let's Learn CSS Grid. My name is Tim Smith, and I am part Guatemalan and part Puerto Rican. I am probably the only Latino you've ever heard that has the name Tim Smith. It's kind of a long story, but if you're interested, you can always ask me later. I started a blog in 2013 called The Bold Report, and it is about design, development, comics, Star Wars, and sometimes technology. I write it together with a couple of friends. I run a design consultancy called Anything Goes, and I do design and development for primarily small to medium-sized businesses, for websites and web applications. Most of the times I help teams write better CSS. In January, I became a design mentor at Block, and Block is an online school to teach design, front-end development, and back-end development if you haven't heard of it before. So, what are we learning today? Number one, problems that we've had with layout, because holy crap, we've had a lot of them. What is CSS Grid, and how does it solve some of these problems that we've had historically? Why do I need to learn this? That is a perfectly valid question, and I will try to answer that question for you today. And lastly, some resources. This is about a 40 to 45 minute talk. It is impossible to cover it all. We're just going to scratch the surface. So I want to give you the tools so that you can go on and learn a little bit more. So let's talk a little bit about the problems that we've had with layouts. I'm only going to talk about 10 years back. I've only been working on the web for about 10 years. So that means that I've built about one table layout. I'm very fortunate. For all of those who have built table layouts, I salute you. You are heroes. So let's talk about floats first. Technically speaking, we have been using floats, up until recently. A lot of us still are using floats, and it's this thing that we've been using for a long time. But the reality is that they're a hack, right? Floats are one hack that the specification for floats was not supposed to be used for layout the way that we've been using it. And it's led to other hacks, like for example clearfix. If you've used ever a float layout, you understand that when you float one element, that container no longer recognizes the height of the floated element. So if you have multiple floated elements within that container, it just creates a mess. So what we did was we created clearfix, which you add to your CSS, and it makes this container automatically recognize the height of those elements within it. But this is just one of the many problems that we've had with floats over the years. And because of that, it's led to a lot of CSS frameworks. We've used CSS frameworks so that this job of creating CSS layouts is easier. And it's led to a lot of markup that looks like this, right? Where you describe your layout. So you describe how it grows with the browser over time. In this situation, small 12, medium 6, large 8, that's telling the containers how big they need to be as the browser grows. And this is not good because it completely goes against what we've learned is the right way of doing things, which means that we do not describe our layout in our HTML. Those things should be separate. We should be doing our layout stuff in CSS. Now, before anyone starts thinking that I hate floats, that's definitely not the case. Floats have their utility. For example, when you need to float text around an image or a piece of content, this is really what floats were made for. So floats aren't bad. It's just that they're not for complex layouts. And we've realized this over the years, that floats makes complex layout very, very difficult because it's a lot of code and a lot of messing around to get it to work. So with floats, why is it so bad? Well, let's talk about a few reasons. Number one, you need to know the exact width of a column, right? So if you have a container, you want to have columns within that container you need to know the exact width of each of those columns. So let's say that you have 5, you've programmed, how the 5 are going to work, and you've already done media queries, everything's working. Now you need to add a 6th column. How do you do that? You have to rewrite everything, right? And that's a big pain. So also, creating space between columns is a lot of math. And I don't know about you, but I got into this thinking that I wouldn't have to do math because I hate math. And yet, with floats, what it means is that you want to add margin to each column, right, to space them. And that means that now you need to factor in the space between each column into now the width of your columns. And this just gets ridiculous, especially when you're doing stuff like percentages and you're mixing them with rem or m. It's a lot of work. You can use padding, which is what I've used many, many times, and that works unless your column has a background, right? Because then the padding is only working within the box and is not spacing outside of it. Also, it's led to complex nth child selectors. If you don't know what nth child selectors are, again, I salute you. But we'll talk about it a little bit in a second. Now, remember doing this with floats. This is impossible. You have 3 different boxes, and they're all the same height. And doing that with floats required hard-coding values and stuff that are basically hacks as well. So Flexbox was a breath of fresh air for a lot of us. And the nice thing about Flexbox is in its name, that it is flexible. Flexbox understands how much space it has. It can adjust based on that space. And this can be really good, but it also can be bad in certain scenarios, and we're going to talk about that as well. For example, let's talk about a sidebar and main column situation where you want to make these flexible across different browser widths. So the way that we would set that up is we would have an aside and then a main content, let's say. Then, by adding our CSS, we would say on the body, for example, let's do display flex on the body. On the aside, we'll give it a background color just so that we can differentiate it. Although now I'm thinking that these background colors are not contrasty enough for this screen. But anyway, so flex, you tell it to grow and shrink, and the flex basis is 30%. On the main, you're saying background color again, just to differentiate it, and then flex 1170, which means that the aside will occupy about 30% of the space most of the time, and then the other one will occupy about 70% of the time. So this is what that looks like. So you've got 2 columns that are completely flexible. You can pull in the browser, and they're just there. Nothing breaks. It's perfect. Okay, now let's talk about a flexible card layout. You've probably seen these. You've got like 3 different columns of cards. Let's say you have them 3 up, then you want them 2 up, then 1. How would you create this? So with HTML, you'd say, an unordered list. Let's call it boxes, and we'll have 5 list items within there. And then in our CSS, what we'll do is display flex on the boxes, because boxes is going to be our flex container. And we'll say flex wrap so that they wrap to the next line if there are more. And then for each list item, we're going to say that they flex and they shrink and they grow 1. Their flex basis is 30%. And we're putting a little bit of margin so that we can see them. And, oh man, I really needed to bump up the contrast on these boxes. Can anybody see those boxes? No? Oh, that is disappointing. All right, well, I mean, you can kind of see it, I guess. Like you have 1 box, 2 box, and the 3rd box, right? Imagine like 3 squares or 3 rectangles that are the same width. But then you have 2 boxes down here that are not the same width. They span the whole width of the flex container. And the reason that happens is because Flexbox wants to adjust based on the space that is available, right? You can fix this behavior, but it requires hard coding values, and that's not a good thing to do, especially in a flexible environment. So again, we need math here because we need to calculate widths. We need to calculate the margin between each column. And this gets really difficult because, again, you need stuff like this. You need an nth child selector on the list item. And this complicated, like algebraic looking type of function, 2n plus 2, says that every second container is not going to receive margin. But wait a second, we need to design for larger screens, right? So then we're going to put them 3 up. And that means that you need a media query that looks something like this, where after it reaches the point of 40M and above, you say, well, nth child 2n plus 2, put back the margin that I took off, and then for the third container, now eliminate the margin from that one. And you know, I love doing this. It's just my favorite thing. So the reality, though, is that Flexbox is awesome. It really is. It has switched us from this mentality of individual items to a container mentality with flex items within it. Properties like align items, justify content have given us more control over how items are displayed and where. And let's not forget, Flexbox has given us a way to vertical align things. We can now vertically align things without a hack. And let's just think about how ridiculous it is that it took us this long to have something that would allow us to vertically align things so easily. Here's the problem, though. We've been using Flexbox wrong. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. Is Flexbox is amazing, but we've been using it to do a two-dimensional grid, which is the wrong use of Flexbox. And that's why CSS Grid is coming to our rescue. So first, let's talk about the things that CSS Grid is not, and then we'll talk about the things that CSS Grid is. So first off, CSS Grid is not a float killer. So I'm not here to tell you that CSS Grid is going to completely replace floats. It should not. Also, it is not a Flexbox killer. CSS Grid is not going to replace Flexbox. We're going to learn a little bit about what their relationship is in a moment. Also, you don't need a framework. There have been a lot of frameworks, Bootstrap and Foundation being some of the most popular, but you don't need these anymore because CSS Grid makes it easy for you to write your own grid. And the reason why is that CSS Grid is the framework, and it's baked right into the browser, and it is amazing. So let's talk about what CSS Grid is. CSS Grid is the framework. CSS Grid is also friendly. You don't have to replace everything with CSS Grid. The whole page doesn't have to be in this new property. You can find tutorials online, and we'll talk a little bit about them in this one, about how to do some of these things, but you don't have to do everything in CSS Grid. The right use of CSS Grid is often the one that is right for you. All of my demos just suck. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay. Well, try to imagine squares everywhere. So I have a small square in the left side that is supposed to signify a logo, then a navigation square, and then a search square. And this is still a great use of Flexbox. So if you have a header that has multiple items that are all in one row, this is still a perfect use of Flexbox. Flexbox can see how much space there is and how to fill it. So for example, if you had more navigation items suddenly, it wouldn't break because you now can just flex it. It will expand or contract based on the available space. The search would also fill up any space that might be available. What about this? All right, again, imagine a box. So there's a box there, and let's say it's an image. You have floated text around it. This is still a perfect use of floats. This is what floats were made for, actually, to flow text around an image or a piece of content. And interestingly, if you were to shrink this browser down, it would still be intact. It wouldn't break. So then, what is CSS Grid good for? Well, I really like this quote from Jen Simmons. She's been a very big evangelist of the CSS Grid spec. And she says that my simple theory at the moment, if you're putting widths on flex items, you are doing it wrong. Use grid, and then with the caveat, let's see if that holds. And I think it will hold, because the times where we hack Flexbox to create a two-dimensional grid is where we should probably be using CSS Grid. And also, when she says, if you're putting widths on something, I think that means whether it's a flexible width or whether it's fixed. You should probably not be using Flexbox. So let's go over some of the CSS Grid basics. Number one, display grid. A grid container works a lot like a Flexbox container. You can put a lot of different rules or properties on this container to affect the elements within it. And the way that you create a grid container is just display grid. Another one that we'll need to know is grid template columns. And grid template columns, what that does is that it tells our grid container how many columns we want within our grid container. And this new property accepts all the lengths that we use right now, like rem, m, pixels, viewport height, viewport width, and percentages. It also accepts a new unit, which is called the FR. And the FR is short for fraction. It's a new unit that shipped with CSS Grid, and this new unit is exactly as the name describes. It is a fraction of the grid container. And I'll show you how this property works in a bit. The other one, this is a really great one, is grid gap. And this property is a shorthand for grid row gap and grid column gap. And it creates a gutter between our columns and rows. This one property eliminates the need to add margin or padding to create space between columns or rows. And I think after seeing how grid gap works, you will be amazed. So if you have your laptop with you and you'd like to follow along with the rest of the talk, you definitely can. I'll be walking through how to implement things. The one thing that you just have to know, you need to have the latest version of Chrome or Firefox to make it work. All right? So let's see all of this in action. Number one. Oh, you got to be kidding me. All right. So we've got this. We've got a Holy Grail layout, but again, you have to imagine boxes. This is the most magical presentation that you've had to go to. Like, you have to imagine things. So, all right. So imagine that you have a header box up there on the side, you have a main content, and then you have a footer. And in your mind, imagine that there are boxes around each of these pieces. I didn't know that this was called the Holy Grail layout, but okay, let's go with that. So the setup for this is, first we're going to put in our markup. So we have a header, we have an aside, we have a main, and we have a footer. Pretty simple. Then we're going to, on the body, we'll say display grid. And we're going to say grid template columns 2 fractions, 3 fractions. And a grid gap of 2 rem. So when it says 2 fractions and 3 fractions, what that means is that the grid container is going to divide up the space in 5 equal fractions. And then assign 2 to the first column and assign 3 to the second column. Does that make sense? Okay. Now we're going to place our items. So the header, we're going to say grid column, start at line 1, and span 2 columns. The aside, we're going to say grid column end, we want it to span 1 column. And it's going to start at grid row number 2. Our main, we're going to say grid column 2, span 1 column. And the grid row 2, which means it's going to be on the same row as the aside. And our footer is going to span from column line 1, span 2, and then grid row number 3. So there's some interesting stuff here, like grid lines, and let's talk about that. So we've got our grid lines here. And thankfully you can see them here. Oh, thank goodness. Okay, so you've got grid column line 1, which starts over there. Grid column line 2 starts at the beginning of our main, and then grid column 3 is at the end of our grid container. Grid row line 1 starts at the top of our grid container, then 2, which starts at the beginning of the main and aside. Number 3 is at the beginning of the footer, and number 4 is at the end of our grid container. So the general rule of thumb from what I've seen is however many columns you have an extra grid line. So if you have 2 columns, you have 3 column lines. If you have 3 rows, you have 4 row lines. Okay, so we're going to rewrite this now with something called grid areas. So we're going to have all the information that we had before: display grid, grid template columns, 2 fractions, 3 fractions. We'll say grid gap of 2 rem. And now we're going to use a new property called grid template areas. And here we're going to say header, header, aside main, and footer, footer. And what that means is the first line is that first row that we have. So it's going to be header, header in the first row, and it's going to span both columns. The second line is row 2, and we have the aside in the first column and the main in the second column. And then footer, footer says in the third row, put footer in both first and second columns. And again, imagine boxes. It looks exactly the same as it did before. Now, what if we did something like this, where instead of the header being in the first column, we just put a period there, and then in the third row, we also put a period and then footer. And what that would do is that it would line up our header with the main and the footer. So it would no longer span the whole width. The aside would be all by itself. So this is awesome. It allows us to specify layouts easily, and modifying our layouts for smaller screen also gets a lot easier. By default, grid only has 1 column. So we're going to rewrite our CSS one more time so that we can do smaller screens, and then it'll grow for our larger screens. So let's do this again. For our body, we'll say display grid again, grid gap 2 rem. But instead, we'll say grid template areas, header, main, aside, footer. And here we're only assigning what's in each row because it only has 1 column. Then, when it grows past 40M, then we're putting in our 2 columns, which are 2 fractions and 3 fractions. And we're putting back our grid template areas like we did before. So what that means is that at a smaller scale, you would get everything in line, and then as it grows, things would align themselves. And again, imagine boxes. That should have been the title of the talk. Imagine boxes. Okay. All right. So Card layout. So again, we have 3 different boxes on one line, and we have 3 different boxes on a second line. And we've all seen this layout. You want them, let's say, 3 up, then 2 up, then 1 as the browser gets smaller, right? So first, let's set up our boxes. We'll do a UL of class boxes again. And we'll have 6 different list items within that. And now we'll put them on the grid by saying display grid, grid template columns, repeat autofill min max 300 pixels 1 FR, and grid gap 1 rem. Oh yeah, there was something new there. Okay, so let's dissect this. This new who knows what is there. So first of all, let's talk about the repeat. The repeat function allows us to tell the browser to repeat on the values that we're about to give it. So it usually has 2 different values that you need to give it. You need to give it how many you want it to repeat, and then the second part is what is the size of the thing that you want it to repeat. So the first thing that we're saying is repeat autofill. And that keyword tells the browser that the browser needs to determine how many of whatever we're telling it to put in there fit within the grid container. Then min-max says, I want the minimum size of these containers or of these boxes to be 300 pixels, and I want the max to be 1 fraction. So that means that they are going to be a minimum of 300 pixels and then a maximum of whatever space is left. And you would get something like this. So as you grow the browser, it automatically knows that it can fit 2, then it can fit 3. And then as you make the browser smaller, it goes down to 2, down to 1. So we created that card layout with 3 lines of code. 3. And it's completely responsive. We don't have to write any other media queries. Nothing. I mean, that's amazing. Let's talk about another layout that you can't see. So this is a special portfolio-inspired layout. So this is something that I made for my portfolio. And basically, it combines a couple of grids. So it spans, and then it has like, this is so difficult. Let me see if I can do something here. To just get you to visualize it. So, oh, I don't have an internet connection. All right. So that's not going to work. All right. Well, hopefully you can understand the gist of it. You've got one item that spans the whole way. You've got another item that is kind of like a box there. Then you've got item 3, which spans the whole way. And then you've got 2 items down here. The way that we would set that up in HTML, you would put an unordered list. I gave it a class of portfolio. I have 5 items within that unordered list. Then we get these things on the grid, and we're going to say display grid, grid auto rows min max 100 pixels auto, grid gap of only 2 pixels, and a grid template columns. We're going to use the repeat again, and here you can see the syntax a little bit better. 6 of 1 fraction. So let's talk a little bit about grid auto rows for a second. So grid automatically creates new rows that you can place things in, and that's called the implicit grid. These rows are usually whatever size the content that is within them. So these are usually whatever size the content is that is within them. So grid auto rows, what it allows us to do is to specify the size of these automatically created rows. So in this occasion, we're saying that we want the rows to be at least 100 pixels and then to grow depending on the content available. So again, let's place our items. And we're going to use nth child here because it's easy. So grid column, we're going to start at line 1, and it's going to end at line -1. What does that mean? Line -1 is the last line of the grid container. So if you don't know the line that is the last line of the grid container, you can just put -1 and it'll span the whole grid container. So the second one, grid column, will start at line 1, and we want it to span 2 columns. Grid row end, which means how many rows it's going to span, we'll say span 3 rows. And grid column 3, and it's going to span 4 columns. And it's going to span also 2 rows. And then the last 2, if you remember, you saw 2 little ones that just span 2 columns each at the bottom. Oops. And again, here is what that kind of looks like. Yeah. You can view the slides after so that you can actually see these. So these type of layouts were not possible before. But with CSS Grid, this type of stuff is easy, where we place things on the page and we don't have to worry about it. We don't have to use things like position absolute to place things on the page. And when I was creating this particular demo, this last demo for this talk, it took me about 5 minutes to make. So again, the time that we're saving is pretty awesome. And again, this is the power of CSS Grid. It has a lot of power, and it's going to help us do some amazing things going forward. So I know what some of you may be thinking. Okay, Tim, this is all cool, but what about the support, right? Browser support. Well, let's take a look at that. So in terms of browser support, the latest versions of Firefox and Chrome have shipped CSS Grid. Opera, since I made this, which was just a few days ago, has shipped number 44. So Opera now supports it. So 3 big desktop browsers support it. Safari 10.1 is going to come out, I believe, in about 2 to 3 weeks. So then Safari will support it. So 4 major desktop browsers will support CSS Grid within a month from now. And you also see on the left side that Edge and IE are like kind of green, but not really. And yeah, no, I mean, well, so I actually want to defend Edge here. So the Edge team actually worked really hard in implementing the first version of the CSS Grid spec. But unfortunately, they did not ship the most latest version in their browser when these 2 other major ones supported it. At the moment, it is something in their backlog. They are not actively looking to implement this spec. But I think that the best way to help browser manufacturers to implement these features is, number 1, vote for those features. You can find the developer blog where you can vote on these features. And number 2, we vote with our code. So ship code that they then need to implement. I think Edge is trying to redo their past. So they're trying to be better. So, yeah. All right.
That right-hand side seems scary to me. With everything going mobile first, it's empty.
Right. So the question is, everything is going mobile first, and this whole right side is empty. Yes. I can't speak to that right now because I don't know what the plans are for these mobile browsers. But we're going to talk about how to support browsers that don't support CSS Grid. Okay? All right. So the question is, why now? If the support is so bad, why now? And I mean, it kind of goes with your question. Number one, it's our job. We got into an industry that moves pretty quickly, and there's always something new to learn. And we want to do the best work that we possibly can for our clients and employers. And I think that while the support of CSS Grid is not great right now, I think it's in our benefit to learn this new spec. Number two is actually simpler code. Like we considered before, you have a very complex layout that is done in 3 lines of code. And that is amazing. That's something that we haven't been able to do before. Also, new amazing layouts. There's so much at our disposal. We've been in this rut of layouts. And Jen Simmons actually has a great talk on that, about the fact that floats have kind of forced us to do the same type of layouts over and over and over again. But CSS Grid gives us this ability to make new, interesting layouts that were not possible before. And more specifically, became even more difficult because we had to plan for different browser widths. And this is a big one. I delayed learning Flexbox, and I regret that very much because Flexbox has made my job easier. And I didn't want to do that with CSS Grid. I know that the support is not great right now, but I think within the year, we'll have great CSS Grid support. And I wanted to be one of the first people to learn it. So how do we support those older browsers, or the browsers that do not have CSS Grid in it? The short answer is feature queries. So for those of you that don't know what feature queries are, they kind of look like this. And what it means is that you put your styles for CSS Grid in a block that says add supports display grid, which means that the browser that understands CSS Grid. And then for those that don't support CSS Grid, you put the fallback CSS in there. And that could be a whole talk in and of itself. So we're not gonna spend too much time on that. Yeah? I don't think that there's a polyfill for CSS Grid at the moment. Yeah. But yeah, I'd have to do a little bit more research. So let's talk about the support for feature queries. So the support for feature queries is actually really good. We've got Edge, we've got Firefox, Safari, Opera, everything except for IE11. And the nice thing about the fact that IE11 doesn't actually support feature queries is this really great fact that browsers ignore CSS they don't understand, which means that you can still add a fallback to your CSS and IE11 will just ignore it because it doesn't know what it means. So then your fallback CSS will still work. Embrace the cascade. So what did we learn? Number one, CSS Grid is awesome. It drastically simplifies the code that we need to create layouts. We can create new layouts that were close to impossible before. Also, CSS Grid is friendly. Floats, Flexbox, multi-column, all of these different layout properties, these layout tools have their place. And CSS Grid does not replace them. The power really comes when we combine these tools together. And that's when we're going to push our work to a new level. And number three, use it today. Firefox and Chrome and Opera support it. Safari is on the way. This spec is solid. It's been worked on by some very amazingly smart people, and it's here to stay. And if you need to do fallbacks, which most of us do, use @supports. Use the cascade to your advantage. And again, like I said at the beginning, this is only the beginning. We've only scratched the surface of CSS Grid in this talk. There's so much to talk about. But since we only have a limited amount of time together, I want you to go out and learn more about it. So number one, Rachel Andrew. She is amazing. She has been talking about CSS Grid for a long time. Check out her gridbyexample.com. She's got a whole series of videos on CSS Grid, how to use it. She's got tutorials. It's just amazing. It's a great learning resource. I want to wait for everyone to take pictures. That's going to take pictures. The other one is Jen Simmons. And you can find hers at labs.jensimmons.com. She has some great grid examples on there. And it is a great place to do what we all did when we were first starting out, which is inspect, element the hell out of this website. Go in, look at the code, see how she's doing what she's doing, and try to learn from it. And last but not least, the Mozilla Developer Network. They have an excellent guide on CSS Grid, on a lot of different other things too, HTML and JavaScript, and you can find that at developer.mozilla.org. So, questions? Anyone have questions? Wow, I'm shocked. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Did I bother somebody? Your fallback CSS?
Yes.
Doesn't that end up being ridiculously complex?
So the fallback CSS can be complex. The nice thing about it, again, we can embrace the cascade and make sure that the browser sees the CSS that we need to use. And the nice thing is, if you write your layouts in Grid and then you do a fallback, when Grid is fully supported in about a year, you can go back and just delete that chunk. Easy as that. Yes? Yeah, so how would you integrate floats with CSS Grid? That's your question. So the nice thing, again, is that CSS Grid works well with floats. So for example, you can have your different columns set up in CSS Grid, and within them, if you need to float an image to the left or right, you can do that with floats. You can also write your fallbacks with floats if that's what you would like to do. Yeah. Any other questions? No? All righty. Thank you so much. Have a great day.